My name is Bongiwe Ndondo. I'm Chief Executive here at Hlanganisa. And the work that Hlanganisa does includes, and quite importantly, democracy and social accountability. So as we get to the elections, South Africa goes to the polls on the 29th of May. We had different parties launch their manifestos, most of them during the month of February. And when we looked at those manifestos, because we're interested in seeing what the political parties are promising, we realized just how complex it is to go through a manifesto and understand it. And so we had an appreciation of how difficult it must be for ordinary South Africans to take 100 to 200 page document and go through it with understanding. But more importantly, we have two program focal areas. The one is on gender justice, where we look at the rights of women and women empowerment. The other is democracy and social accountability, where we look at the role of citizens in our democracy. And when we married those two program areas, we felt that it was important for us to look at what the political parties are promising the women in South Africa. You will appreciate that we are 30 years into our democracy, and yet the status of women still continues to be quite dire. Women are still on the margins. When you look at gender-based violence levels and femicide levels, they are alarming. It's a pandemic on its own. When you look at economic empowerment, women still continue to be disadvantaged in many socio-economic and even political spaces. So we wanted to look at what the political parties are promising women and whether women's fortunes will change after this election. But we were also interested in giving the tools to communities so that they can also, do the analysis themselves. We advocate for social accountability within any political climate. So for us, our democracy is anchored on the citizens. It's anchored on constitutionalism, and the Constitution is at the apex of our democracy. But it's important that, citizens understand what is in the Constitution. That's what will make our democracy strong. It's important for citizens to understand their role, both from a rights and responsibility perspective. And so for us, we see the political process, in fact, the election process, as a very small component of our bigger democratic framework. We see it as an important process nonetheless. So for us, social accountability is not just within the political cycle. It's beyond the political cycle. It's about how we engage with the institutions that are entrusted with the different elements of, safeguarding our Constitution. How are we engaging with Chapter 9 institutions? How are we engaging with the electoral process? How are we engaging in Parliament and our representatives in Parliament? And so on and so forth. So for us, social accountability is the anchor of our democracy, and we want citizens, and it's about how the extent to which citizens should be active and participating in safeguarding that democracy. I think there hasn't been enough work on constitutional awareness in South Africa, but I think one has to trace it back to our history. So if you look at a lot of the civic spaces post-1994, we felt that, now we have a vote for everyone. And a lot of the civic education that was happening prior to 1994 actually fell away. And so I think, post-1994, we've seen increasingly less and less civic education. But I think in the last 10 years, we've also seen a shrink in the civic space in general. We've seen it shrink partly because a lot of the civil society organizations that have been advocating for greater social accountability and accountability on from public officials have, their funding has decreased over the years. But we're also seeing a despondent citizen. We've gone through several rounds of elections. Nothing has changed. We've gone through, we're 30 years into our democracy, a lot of the social ills that impacted South Africans prior to 1994 are still with us today. So the extent to which citizens have trust in the Constitution delivering on their aspirations is dwindling. And so for that reason, there is less and less engagement. There is lots more, apathy, and that's just within the election cycle, but also less and less meaningful public participation. How we express our dissatisfaction is now increasingly on the streets. So we don't see the Constitution as a means, to express our dissatisfaction with the government, because we've lost faith in the system delivering for us. So we go on the streets, we burn tires, we doi, and often, with justification, because it is often what makes public officials stand up and listen. So increasingly people are using, protests as a way of getting the attention of public officials, and that shouldn't be the case. We're not fixated on the election. So for us, the political process is more than just the election. But the work that we've done on the manifestos is clearly related to the election. And we've done a gender analysis because we think that women are an important constituency. Women make up almost 51% of our population in South Africa. I think some studies put it at 51 point something. And yet we continue to see women being disenfranchised. There is very little participation of women on different platforms. So the voices of women are missing. Many people talk about parity, gender parity. And, we are said to be one of the countries with the highest participation of women in parliament. But the truth is those women don't really have a voice. And therefore, it feels like they've been co-opted onto the male's table. And so we would like to see more awareness around citizens, on what the political parties are promising. And beyond just gender parity, we are looking at, there's a lot of socio-economic issues that impact women disproportionately. Men and women are not impacted the same in relation to the energy crisis, for instance. We know that, the absence of electricity and lighting on our streets increases the incidence of gender-based violence, for instance. And that's an issue that impacts women, more than it does men. So from that perspective, and there's a lot of others I could, climate change, poverty, unemployment, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that impact women disproportionately. So we want to know what the political parties are saying about those issues and how they intend to address them, and whether they are adopting this gender lens in putting together solutions to those challenges. I think there's a lot of things that impact, voting behavior. I don't think that gender is on top of that list. I think for many of us, if you look at the political parties, how many of them have got women in leadership positions? I don't know. I think the Democratic Alliance at some point had Helen Zille. But I don't know how many of the other political parties have had women at the, in their top leadership positions. And yet, so essentially, a lot of women in South Africa are actually voting male-dominated political parties into office. That's not a problem. The problem is the agenda. And that's what we're about. We want to know what's your agenda for women in this country? Whether you are led by a male or female, we want to know what's your agenda. And I think for us, that's what's important. I think it's crucial for citizens to vote in any election, We've come a long way. our democracy was hard fought. So there were a lot of sacrifices that were made, for us to get to where we are. It's imperfect, I agree, but I think it's a very strong foundation we have. We have, I think, a fairly good constitution. I don't want to say it's fantastic, because I think there's a lot of elements. There's still a lot of elements in our constitution that we need to engage with, because South Africa looks different to what it did in 1994. When that constitution was put together, it looks different. So we need to be continuously assessing whether this constitution is still relevant for where South Africa is today. I would like to opine that it is still relevant to a large extent, but I think it's a contract, it's a social contract between, amongst citizens. So we need to be continuously going back to the constitution and satisfying ourselves that it still reflects the values and aspirations of all South Africans. Youth make up the majority of our population. In South Africa, certainly on the continent, we keep talking about the youth dividend, right? I don't think that young people have an appreciation of what kind of muscle they bring into any election. So the same way I've been asking the question, what are the political parties' agenda for women? Young people should be asking, what's your agenda for youth? And if you set all the political parties here and said, this is what we want as the youth of this country. We want 1 up to 10. Whoever is prepared to deliver on this will get our vote. They are looking at least 20% of South Africa's vote. There is no way they would not listen to your demands. No way. So for me, youth need to continuously be motivated. But I think the biggest motivator for youth should actually be, the kind of currency that they bring into any election because of their numbers. There is power in numbers. And I think I want to venture to say, apart from just the numbers, think about your future. Young people should be sufficiently motivated by the fact that any government of the day is making decisions that impact our lives currently, but into the future. And so if the youth are concerned about their future, which I think they should be, then it's important for them to be part of electing a government that reflects their aspirations into the future. So I think that should be enough motivation. First of all, we're hoping that there's going to be a methodological way of choosing the parties that we vote for. What do I mean by that? I think a lot of voting is often on sentimental lines. So I'm hoping that young people are going to be asking the question, why am I voting for this party? What is it offering young people? What is it offering young women? What are they promising in their manifesto? What change can I hope to see, if they come into government? That's what should be informing our voting. If you think of a country, the leaders that we elect into position are actually mandated by us. So if I could borrow from a company, we are the shareholders and we are appointing a CEO, right? So we are the shareholders because this is our country. South Africa belongs to us. And we are appointing a CEO who is going to run South Africa. What are the things we want in that CEO? It can't be based on sentimentality. We must be clear about, the kind of values and attributes that we want or expect from our leaders. So I think that's how I would like to see us approaching this election and any other election, having asked the question, what is in it for me, and using a very, a very technical analysis on why you are voting for a particular party. The manifesto is a good starting point, because a manifesto is a promise that I make. So I want you to vote me into government. So I make a promise, that's my manifesto. It's the only thing you can hold me to. Yeah? But how many of us have actually read any manifesto? We listen to, our leaders, our political leaders on various platforms. They say things, but even if they say things that were not in their manifestos, you're not going to hold them to the things that they said. Yeah? They will come in, but in their manifesto, you're going to say, but this is what you promised. It was in your manifesto. Deliver on it. So I think for Hlanganisa, if we had a more conscious voter, we would have won half the battle. I think we've come a long way. I think we still have a long way to go. We've come a long way. Our democracy is inclusive on paper. The reality is that it's not inclusive. A lot of people still live on the margins of our democracy. A lot of people still do not have access to justice. A lot of people still do not have access to basic socio-economic services. We still live in very violent communities. So there's still a lot of things that need to be fixed. But I think we have the constitution and our democracy, and we must use the provisions that are made to try and change the status quo. We must own the process a little bit more as citizens, because now it feels like somebody in government is going to solve the problem. But I think we need to be active citizens ourselves. We need to engage a lot more, not just in the election period, but throughout the cycle, because it's a cycle from one election to another. We need to be very conscious voters, and we need to familiarize ourselves with what is provided for in the Constitution. You'd be surprised at the kind of public participation that our Constitution envisages, but very little of that happens. Have you been to a public meeting, whether it was on a policy or on a law that is being promulgated? The answer for most people is they haven't. I also haven't. So I'm not I'm not suggesting that we have it figured out. But I think unless we understand the importance of us participating in those processes, and the different touch points, the different entry points, there is the IDP process at local level. How many of us know that we can, through the IDP process, engage our local government officials on how resources are allocated, and how many of us get involved in that process? So I think we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go.